Des Plaines, Illinois, December 11, 1978, 9 p.m. 15-year-old Robert Piest told his mother he'd be right back. He had to talk to a contractor about a summer job. The contractor's name was John Wayne Gacy, and he was at the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a remodeling job with the store's owner. Robert's mother, Elizabeth Piest, waited in the car. It was Robert's birthday. He'd turned 15 that day. The family was planning to go out for dinner to celebrate, but Robert wanted to talk to this contractor first. The man had mentioned he was willing to pay $5 per hour, which was good money for a high school student in 1978. Elizabeth waited. 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Robert didn't come back. Elizabeth went into the pharmacy to look for him. The pharmacy owner said Robert had left about 20 minutes earlier, presumably with the contractor, but nobody had seen where they went. Elizabeth Piest had a mother's intuition that something was terribly wrong. She immediately called the Des Plaines Police Department to report her son missing. Most police departments in 1978 had a policy of waiting 24 to 48 hours before investigating missing persons cases, especially for teenagers who often ran away or stayed at friends' houses without telling their parents. But Lieutenant Joseph Kozingczak of the Des Plaines Police Department took Elizabeth Piest's report seriously. There was something about her insistence, her certainty that this wasn't a typical runaway situation, that convinced him to act immediately. Kozingczak began investigating that very night. He interviewed the pharmacy owner, who identified the contractor as John Wayne Gacy of PDM Contractors. The pharmacy owner gave Kozingczak Gacy's business card and address, 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area just northwest of Chicago. Kozingczak drove to Gacy's house that night. He knocked on the door. John Wayne Gacy answered, a heavy-set man in his mid-30s, balding, wearing glasses, pleasant and cooperative. Kozingczak explained he was investigating the disappearance of Robert Piest. Had Gacy seen the boy? Gacy said no. He'd been at the pharmacy discussing a remodeling job, but he hadn't talked to any teenage boy. He had no idea who Robert Piest was. Kozingczak didn't quite believe him, but he had no evidence to pursue the matter further. He thanked Gacy and left. But Lieutenant Kozingczak continued investigating. He ran a background check on John Wayne Gacy and discovered something shocking. Gacy had been convicted of sodomy in Iowa in 1968 and had served time in prison. He was a convicted sex offender who had moved to Illinois after his release. This changed everything. A teenage boy had disappeared after being last seen with a convicted sex offender. This wasn't a runaway case. This was a potential abduction. On December 13th, 2 days after Robert's disappearance, police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house. They executed the warrant while Gacy was present. They searched every room, every closet, every drawer. They found some suspicious items: a high school ring that didn't belong to Gacy, several driver's licenses and ID cards belonging to young men, prescription bottles with names that weren't Gacy's or his former wife's. But they found no sign of Robert Piest. There was, however, a smell, a terrible smell coming from the crawl space under the house. Gacy explained it as moisture buildup, maybe a broken sewer pipe. The officers made a note of it but didn't investigate further. While the search was ongoing, Lieutenant Kozingczak interviewed Gacy extensively. Gacy remained calm, cooperative, even friendly. He explained that he ran a successful construction business called PDM Contractors. PDM stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance. He employed teenage boys and young men to do various construction jobs. It was a legitimate business. As for the high school ring and the ID cards, Gacy had explanations. Employees sometimes left things at his house. The ring probably belonged to a former employee. He couldn't remember exactly which one. Kozenczak wasn't satisfied. He obtained court permission to place Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. Starting December 15th, Des Plaines police officers followed Gacy everywhere he went. They watched his house. They followed him to work sites. They documented everyone he spoke to. Gacy knew he was being followed. He didn't try to hide it or evade the surveillance. Instead, he seemed to enjoy it. He would wave at the officers. He invited them into his house for breakfast. He acted as if the whole thing was amusing, as if he had nothing to hide. But the surveillance was having an effect. Gacy's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He couldn't sleep. He drank heavily. He made rambling phone calls to friends and business associates. The pressure was building. On December 19th, something strange happened. Gacy invited 2 of the surveillance officers into his house for breakfast. The officers accepted. As they sat in Gacy's kitchen eating eggs and drinking coffee, both officers noticed that terrible smell again. Stronger now, unmistakable. It was the smell of death, of decomposing human flesh. One of the officers, Officer David Hatchmeister, recognized it immediately. He'd smelled it before at other crime scenes. This wasn't a broken sewer pipe or moisture buildup. This was a dead body, maybe more than one. The officers reported this to Lieutenant Kozenczak, but the previous search warrant had already been executed. They needed new evidence to get another warrant to search the crawl space. Meanwhile, the investigation into Robert Piest's disappearance was producing more connections to Gacy. A receipt from the Nissen pharmacy was found in Gacy's possession, a receipt that placed him at the pharmacy at the exact time Robert disappeared. Witnesses were interviewed who confirmed they'd seen Gacy talking to Robert that night. On December 21st, Gacy was arrested on a minor drug charge, possession of marijuana. This gave police a reason to hold him while they gathered more evidence for a murder investigation. While Gacy was in custody, investigators obtained a second search warrant, this time specifically targeting the crawl space under his house. On December 22nd, investigators entered the crawl space. What they found would shock the nation and reveal John Wayne Gacy as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. In the crawl space, a tight, dark area approximately 3 feet high, investigators found human remains. Not one body, not 2, but dozens. Bodies stacked on top of bodies. Bodies in various states of decomposition. Bodies that had been there for months, some for years. The excavation of John Wayne Gacy's house began immediately and would continue for weeks. By the time it was finished, investigators had recovered 29 bodies from the crawl space and the property around Gacy's house, combined with 4 more bodies found in the Des Plaines River that Gacy later confessed to dumping there. The total victim count was 33 young men and boys murdered between 1972 and 1978. 33 murders, 33 families destroyed, all committed by a man who was known in his community as a successful businessman, a Democratic Party precinct captain, a charity volunteer who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain sick children at hospitals. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. This is his complete story. To understand how John Wayne Gacy became capable of such horrific crimes, we must understand his childhood and early life. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, St. Patrick's Day at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robison. His father was an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran. His mother was a homemaker. The family was Catholic. They appeared from the outside to be a normal working-class Chicago family. But inside the Gacy household, dysfunction reigned. John Stanley Gacy Sr., John Wayne's father, was an alcoholic. He drank heavily daily, and when he drank, he became verbally and physically abusive. He beat his children. He beat his wife. and he directed particular venom toward his son. Gacy Sr. constantly berated young John Wayne. He called him dumb and stupid. He told him he would never amount to anything. He compared him unfavorably to his two sisters, calling John Wayne a sissy and a mama's boy. When John Wayne tried to help his father with car repairs or household projects, Gacy Sr. would criticize every move, telling him he was doing it wrong, that he was useless, that he was a disappointment. This paternal abuse would shape John Wayne Gacy's entire life. He spent his childhood and adolescence desperately trying to win his father's approval, trying to prove he wasn't stupid or weak or a sissy. But nothing he did was ever good enough. Gacy was also plagued by health problems as a child. At age 11, he was struck in the head by a playground swing. The injury caused periodic blackouts and seizures throughout his teenage years. Doctors eventually discovered a blood clot on his brain and treated it successfully. But the years of unexplained blackouts had taken a toll on Gacy's self-esteem and his relationship with his father, who accused him of faking the seizures for attention. Gacy also suffered from a heart condition that prevented him from participating in sports or strenuous physical activities. This further reinforced his father's view that John Wayne was weak and sickly. Despite these challenges, Gacy tried to succeed. He was intelligent and personable. He joined the Boy Scouts and earned the rank of Life Scout, just one rank below Eagle Scout. He worked part-time jobs. He tried to be a good son. But nothing satisfied his father. In high school, Gacy struggled academically and socially. He dropped out during his senior year and left Chicago for Las Vegas, hoping to start a new life. But Vegas didn't work out. After a few months working as a janitor at a funeral parlor, a job that would later take on sinister significance given his future crimes, Gacy returned to Chicago. Back home, Gacy enrolled in Northwestern Business College and actually thrived. He graduated and found work as a management trainee for a shoe company. He was good at sales. He was charming, personable, able to connect with customers. He seemed to be finding his path. In 1964, at age 22, Gacy married Marlyn Myers, a coworker whose father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy's father-in-law offered him a management position, and Gacy eagerly accepted. He moved to Waterloo with his new wife, determined to prove himself as a businessman and family man. For a few years, it seemed to work. Gacy managed the KFC restaurant successfully. He and Marlyn had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Gacy became active in the Waterloo JCs, a civic organization for young professionals. He organized charity events. He volunteered. He networked with local business and political leaders. Gacy was finally becoming the successful, respected man he'd always wanted to be. The man his father had told him he could never become. But beneath this facade of normalcy, Gacy was engaging in behaviors that would eventually destroy everything he'd built. Gacy had been struggling with his sexuality since adolescence. He was attracted to men, particularly teenage boys and young men. In the 1960s, homosexuality was not only socially taboo, it was literally illegal in most states. Gacy desperately tried to suppress these urges. He married. He had children. He tried to be heterosexual. But the urges didn't go away, and in Waterloo, Gacy began acting on them. He would invite teenage boys who worked at the KFC restaurants to his house. He would get them drunk, and then he would make sexual advances. Some of the boys went along with it, uncomfortable but not knowing how to refuse their boss. Others refused and left. In 1968, one of these teenage employees, 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, told his father what Gacy had done. Voorhees's father went to the police. Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy, oral sex with a minor. It was a serious felony in Iowa. If convicted, Gacy faced significant prison time. Gacy's response to the charges was to hire another teenager to beat up Donald Voorhees, hoping to intimidate the boy into not testifying. The intimidation attempt failed. The teenager Gacy hired told police about Gacy's plot, leading to additional charges. On December 3, 1968, John Wayne Gacy pleaded guilty to sodomy. He was sentenced to 10 years in the Iowa State Reformatory for Men at Anamosa. Gacy's wife Marlin divorced him while he was in prison. She took their 2 children and moved away. Gacy never saw them again. Gacy's father, John Stanley Gacy Sr., died by suicide on Christmas Day 1969, just over a year after Gacy went to prison. Gacy was not allowed to attend the funeral. This was a devastating blow. Gacy had spent his entire life trying to earn his father's approval. Now his father was dead, and the last thing Gacy Sr. knew about his son was that he was in prison for child molestation. There would never be reconciliation, never be approval, never be that moment when his father finally said, "I'm proud of you, son." In prison, Gacy was a model inmate. He worked hard at his assigned jobs. He joined educational programs. He participated in group activities. He managed the prison chapter of the JCs, organizing charity events even while incarcerated. On June 18, 1970, after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence, John Wayne Gacy was released on parole for good behavior. Iowa officials informed Illinois authorities that a convicted sex offender was moving back to Chicago, but there was no registration requirement at the time, no neighborhood notification, no public database. Gacy simply moved back to Illinois, and nobody in his new community knew about his criminal past. Gacy moved in with his mother in Chicago. He got a job as a cook at a restaurant. He tried to rebuild his life. In 1971, Gacy was accused of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Chicago. The boy reported that Gacy had picked him up, driven him to a remote location, and attempted to force him into oral sex. But the boy didn't show up for the court date, and the charges were dropped. Iowa authorities were never informed about these new charges, so Gacy's parole was never revoked. He remained free. In 1972, Gacy bought a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area just northwest of Chicago. The house was modest, a single-story ranch with 3 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a garage. It also had a crawl space under the house, accessed through a trapdoor in one of the bedrooms. That same year, Gacy married again. His second wife, Carol Hoff, was a divorcee with 2 daughters. Carol had known Gacy in high school and had reconnected with him through friends. She knew Gacy had been married before and divorced, but she didn't know about his conviction for sodomy or his time in prison. Gacy never told her. Gacy and Carol appeared to have a normal marriage at first. Gacy was affectionate toward Carol's daughters. He worked hard. He started his own construction business, PDM Contractors, and it became successful. But there were warning signs Carol couldn't ignore. Their sexual relationship was minimal. Gacy showed little interest in sex with his wife. He often stayed out all night, claiming he had business meetings or construction jobs. He smelled strange sometimes, like rotting garbage or sewage. And she found pornography in the house, gay pornography depicting teenage boys and young men. When Carol confronted Gacy about the pornography, he admitted he was bisexual. He promised he would change, but the behavior continued. What Carol didn't know, what nobody knew, was that John Wayne Gacy had committed his first murder on January 3, 1972, shortly after buying the Summerdale Avenue house. The victim was Timothy Jack McCoy, 16 years old, from Michigan. McCoy was traveling from Michigan to Omaha, Nebraska, to visit his father. He had a layover at the Greyhound bus terminal in Chicago. Gacy was at the bus terminal. He later claimed he was there to view ice sculptures that were on display in the Loop for a winter festival. He saw Timothy McCoy, a clean-cut teenage boy traveling alone. Gacy approached him, struck up a conversation, learned that McCoy's bus didn't leave until noon the next day. Gacy offered McCoy a place to stay for the night and a ride back to the bus station in the morning. McCoy accepted. They went to Gacy's house. According to Gacy's later confession, they watched television, talked, and then both went to sleep, Gacy in his bedroom, McCoy in a spare room. But when Gacy woke up the next morning, he found McCoy standing in the doorway of his bedroom. McCoy was holding a kitchen knife. Gacy claimed he thought McCoy was about to attack him, so Gacy fought back. He wrestled the knife away from McCoy and stabbed the teenager repeatedly in the chest. McCoy died on Gacy's bedroom floor. Later, when investigators analyzed this account, they concluded Gacy was probably lying. Timothy McCoy had most likely gotten up early to make breakfast for his host as a thank-you gesture. Teenagers in 1972 were often taught to be polite and helpful to adults. McCoy had probably gone to the kitchen to get a knife to cut something for breakfast and had come to Gacy's bedroom to wake him up. But Gacy had interpreted this innocent action as an attack and had used it as an excuse to kill the boy and act out the violent sexual fantasies he'd been harboring for years. After murdering McCoy, Gacy had a sexual experience with the corpse. He later admitted this to investigators. Then he faced the problem of disposing of the body. Gacy wrapped McCoy's body in plastic and hid it in his closet while he figured out what to do. Eventually, he placed the body in his car trunk, drove to a bridge over the Des Plaines River, and threw McCoy's body into the water. Timothy McCoy's body was never found. His family reported him missing. Police investigated but found no leads. The case went cold. For Gacy, something fundamental had changed. He'd killed someone. He'd acted out his darkest fantasy. And rather than feel horror or remorse, he felt satisfaction, excitement, a sense of power and control he'd never experienced before. He wanted to feel it again. But for reasons Gacy never fully explained, he didn't kill again for over a year. Perhaps the murder of Timothy McCoy had frightened him. Perhaps he was trying to resist his urges. Perhaps he was focused on building his business and his marriage. But by 1974, Gacy had resumed killing, and this time he wouldn't stop. Between 1974 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy would murder at least 32 more young men and boys, bringing his total victim count to 33. But the actual number may be higher. Gacy hinted at additional victims but never provided details. Gacy developed a method for finding victims. He would cruise areas of Chicago known for male prostitution and runaways, the Uptown neighborhood, the Greyhound bus terminal, certain bars and hangouts. He would offer young men money for sex or for construction work. He would offer them rides. He would invite them to his house for drinks or to smoke marijuana. Once he got them to his house, Gacy would use what he called the handcuff trick. He would tell the young men he knew a magic trick involving handcuffs. He would demonstrate by putting the handcuffs on himself and escaping. Then he would ask the young man to try it. Once the handcuffs were on the victim's wrists, Gacy would reveal the truth. The trick was that there was no trick. The victim was now completely helpless. Gacy would then rape and torture his victims for hours. He would strangle them slowly with a rope, sometimes loosening the rope to let them breathe before tightening it again. He would talk to them as they died, telling them this was their fault for being stupid enough to trust him. Many of Gacy's victims were male prostitutes or runaways, young men who lived on the margins of society, whose disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. This allowed Gacy to kill for years without being detected. After killing his victims, Gacy would store the bodies under his bed for up to 24 hours while he decided what to do with them. Eventually, he developed a system. He would carry the bodies to the crawl space under his house through a trapdoor in his bedroom closet. He would bury them in shallow graves he dug in the crawl space. As the number of bodies increased, Gacy ran out of space in the crawl space. He began burying bodies in other parts of his property, under the garage, in the backyard. When he ran out of space entirely, he began throwing bodies into the Des Plaines River. Throughout this period, Gacy maintained his double life with remarkable efficiency. By day, he was a respected member of the community. PDM Contractors was successful. Gacy had multiple employees, many of them teenage boys. He was active in Democratic Party politics and had his picture taken with First Lady Rosalynn Carter at a Democratic fundraiser. He performed as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals and charity events. By night, he was a serial killer who was burying bodies under his house. Gacy's marriage to Carol ended in divorce in 1976. Carol had become increasingly suspicious of Gacy's behavior, his strange smells, his late nights, his lack of interest in their sexual relationship, the sounds she sometimes heard coming from the crawl space. But she didn't suspect murder. She thought Gacy was just having affairs with men. After the divorce, Gacy lived alone in the house on Summerdale Avenue. This gave him even more freedom to kill. He accelerated his murder pace dramatically. Between 1976 and 1978, Gacy killed at least 24 more victims. The house began to smell. The neighbors noticed it. Gacy's employees noticed it. Visitors noticed it. Gacy explained it as moisture buildup in the crawl space, as sewage problems, as dead rats in the walls. People accepted these explanations because nobody wanted to believe the alternative. Some of Gacy's victims were his own employees. John Butkovich, 17 years old, worked for PDM Contractors. In July 1975, Butkovich and Gacy had an argument about unpaid wages. Butkovich disappeared that same day. His car was found abandoned near his parents' house with the keys still in the ignition. Butkovich's family suspected Gacy had something to do with the disappearance. They contacted police multiple times, but without evidence, police couldn't arrest Gacy. Gregory Godzik, 17 years old, also worked for PDM Contractors. He disappeared in December 1976. His car was found abandoned, just like Butkovich's. Police in multiple jurisdictions were receiving reports of young men disappearing after being seen with John Wayne Gacy or after working for PDM Contractors. But the investigations were fragmented. Different police departments didn't share information effectively. And without bodies, without evidence, police couldn't build a case. In 1977, Des Plaines police became suspicious enough that they placed Gacy under surveillance after a 9-year-old boy was reported missing under circumstances suggesting he'd been with Gacy. Police watched his house, saw multiple young men coming and going at all hours, but couldn't find evidence of a crime. Gacy knew he was being watched. It amused him. He would wave at the surveillance officers. He felt untouchable. And for years he was. The killings continued. By December 1978, there were 29 bodies buried on Gacy's property and 4 more in the Des Plaines River. Then 15-year-old Robert Piest disappeared, and everything changed. When police arrested John Wayne Gacy on December 21, 1978, they didn't initially charge him with murder. They arrested him on minor drug charges, possession of marijuana and drug paraphernalia. This gave them time to hold him while they obtained a search warrant for the crawl space. On December 22nd, investigators entered the crawl space under Gacy's house. The scene they discovered was beyond comprehension. In the low, tight space, barely 3 feet high, dirt floor, no lighting, investigators found human remains stacked like cordwood, bodies on top of bodies. Skeletal remains mixed with partially decomposed corpses. The smell was overwhelming. Even experienced homicide detectives became physically ill. The excavation began immediately and would continue for weeks. Investigators worked in shifts, carefully removing remains, documenting everything, trying to identify victims. The media descended on Summerdale Avenue. News cameras recorded everything. Crowds of onlookers gathered behind police lines, watching as body after body was carried out of Gacy's house. Meanwhile, Gacy was in custody at Des Plaines Police Headquarters. On December 22nd, he gave a full confession. He admitted to killing 33 young men and boys since 1972. He drew diagrams showing where bodies were buried in the crawl space. He provided names of some victims. He described his methods in disturbing detail. Gacy showed no remorse. He claimed the victims were responsible for their own deaths because they'd engaged in homosexual acts with him or had tried to rob him. He portrayed himself as the real victim, a man driven to kill by society's condemnation of homosexuality. The confession was chilling not because Gacy seemed evil or monstrous, but because he seemed so ordinary, so rational, so matter-of-fact. He described murders the way someone might describe a business transaction. By December 30th, 1978, investigators had recovered 29 bodies from Gacy's property, 26 from the crawl space, 3 from other parts of the property. Over the following weeks, 4 more bodies were found in the Des Plaines River that Gacy admitted to dumping there when he ran out of room on his property. The total, 33 confirmed victims. Identifying the victims proved incredibly difficult. Most were in advanced stages of decomposition. Many were skeletal remains. Dental records and X-rays were used when possible. Personal effects found in Gacy's house helped identify some victims. But 8 victims could never be identified. They became known only by their recovery numbers: Victim 19, Victim 21, Victim 26, and so on. Despite extensive efforts, including renewed DNA testing in 2011, most of these victims remain unidentified to this day. The identified victims ranged in age from 14 to 21. Most were teenagers. Many were runaways or male prostitutes. Some, like John Butkovich and Gregory Godzik, had worked for Gacy's construction company. Some had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, like Robert Piest, who only wanted information about a summer job. Here are some of the victims whose identities were confirmed. Timothy McCoy, 16, Gacy's first victim, killed January 3, 1972, body never recovered. John Butkovich, 17, Gacy employee, killed July 31, 1975, buried in the garage. Gregory Godzik, 17, Gacy employee, killed December 12, 1976, buried in crawl space. John Scheich, 19, killed January 20, 1977, buried in crawl space, identified by his Maine West High School class ring found in Gacy's house. John Prestage, 20, killed March 15, 1977, buried in crawl space. Matthew Bowman, 19, killed July 5, 1977, buried in crawl space. Robert Gilra, 18, killed September 15, 1977, buried in crawl space. And many, many more. 17 victims total who were identified over the years through dental records, personal effects, and eventually DNA testing. But the victim who changed everything, who finally brought Gacy to justice, was Robert Piest, 15 years old, killed December 11, 1978. His body was found in the Des Plaines River on April 9, 1979, months after his disappearance. If Robert Piest's mother hadn't insisted on an immediate police investigation, if Lieutenant Kozenzak hadn't taken her seriously, if investigators hadn't discovered Gacy's prior conviction and pursued him relentlessly despite his denials, Robert Piest would have been just another unidentified victim buried somewhere on Gacy's property. And Gacy might have continued killing for years longer. John Wayne Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, in Chicago. Gacy had already confessed to all 33 murders, so the trial wasn't about whether he'd committed the crimes. The trial was about whether he was sane or insane when he committed them. Gacy's defense attorneys argued that he was legally insane, that he suffered from severe mental illness that prevented him from understanding right from wrong or from controlling his behavior. They presented expert witnesses who testified that Gacy had multiple personality disorder, that different personalities within Gacy's mind had committed the murders without his conscious knowledge. The prosecution argued that Gacy knew exactly what he was doing, that he took elaborate precautions to avoid detection, that he lured victims methodically and disposed of their bodies carefully. These actions demonstrated he understood his crimes were wrong and that he could control his behavior. The jury heard testimony from psychiatrists and psychologists on both sides. They heard from survivors, young men who had escaped from Gacy's house before he could kill them. They heard from police officers who described the horror of excavating 29 bodies from Gacy's crawl space. And they heard from Gacy himself, who testified in his own defense. Gacy's testimony was bizarre. He claimed he had no memory of killing most of his victims. He claimed that employees or accomplices had committed some of the murders. He blamed the victims, saying they deserved to die because they tried to blackmail him or rob him. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Lead prosecutor William Kunkel displayed photographs of Gacy's 22 identified victims. He showed each photo to the jury one by one, making them look at the faces of the young men Gacy had killed. He reminded them that these weren't hypothetical victims or statistics. They were real people, sons, brothers, boyfriends, friends. Show justice, Kunkel told the jury, not sympathy, justice. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On March 13, 1980, they returned their verdict. John Wayne Gacy was sane. He was guilty of 33 counts of murder. The next day, the same jury deliberated on sentencing. After 2 hours and 15 minutes, they recommended the death penalty. Judge Louis B. Garippo formally sentenced Gacy to death. Under Illinois law at the time, Gacy would be executed by lethal injection. John Wayne Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. His case went through multiple appeals, all of which were denied. During his time on death row, Gacy became somewhat of a celebrity. He gave interviews to journalists and authors. He corresponded with people around the world. He painted dozens of paintings, many featuring clowns which he sold for thousands of dollars. These paintings became controversial. Some saw them as macabre collectibles. Others saw them as disgusting attempts by a serial killer to profit from his notoriety. In June 1994, just after Gacy's execution, several of his paintings were publicly burned by a group including families of his victims. Gacy maintained his innocence throughout his time on death row, despite having confessed to the murders. He claimed police had coerced his confession. He claimed he'd been framed. He claimed other people had committed the murders and he'd just helped dispose of bodies. Nobody believed him. On May 9, 1994, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected Gacy's final appeal. The execution was scheduled for May 10, 1994. On the evening of May 9th, Gacy ate his last meal, a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, an ironic choice given his history managing KFC restaurants in Iowa, fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. He spent his final hours speaking with family members and with his attorneys. He gave a final statement maintaining his innocence. On May 10, 1994, at 12, 8:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old. His final words were, "Kiss my ass." Outside the prison, a crowd of approximately 1,000 people had gathered. When news came that Gacy had been executed, the crowd cheered and chanted. Some held signs reading, "No tears for the clown and Gacy's in hell." The families of Gacy's victims had mixed reactions to his execution. Some felt relief that Gacy was finally gone. Others felt that death was too easy for him, that he should have spent the rest of his life in prison suffering. Still others felt empty. Gacy's death didn't bring back their sons and brothers. John Wayne Gacy's case raised profound questions about evil, about how serial killers can hide in plain sight, about the failures of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. How did Gacy kill 33 people over 6 years without being caught? Several factors contributed. First, many of Gacy's victims were marginalized young men, runaways, male prostitutes, teenagers estranged from their families. Their disappearances often went unreported or were not investigated thoroughly. In the 1970s, there was a pervasive attitude that teenage runaways had brought whatever happened to them on themselves. Second, Gacy was superficially respectable. He was a successful businessman. He was politically active. He performed charity work. He didn't fit the stereotype of a serial killer. Police found it hard to believe that the man who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain sick children could be a murderer. Third, law enforcement agencies didn't communicate effectively. Multiple police departments had received reports of young men disappearing after contact with Gacy, but each department investigated separately without sharing information. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, societal attitudes toward homosexuality enabled Gacy's crimes. In the 1970s, homosexuality was stigmatized. Gay men lived largely closeted lives. Male prostitution and homosexual encounters happened in shadowy spaces where police rarely intervened. This meant that young gay men or men who engaged in homosexual activity were vulnerable to predators like Gacy. And when they disappeared, investigations were often less thorough than they would have been for heterosexual victims. The Gacy case helped change some of these dynamics. It demonstrated the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies. It showed the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, even for runaways and marginalized youth. It highlighted how serial killers often don't look like monsters. They look like ordinary people. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Gacy case is the memory of the victims. In 1980, the 9 victims who couldn't be identified were buried in a mass grave at Hillside Cemetery in Chicago. Their headstone reads, "We are remembered." Over the years, efforts continued to identify these victims. In 2011, Cook County Sheriff Thomas Dart announced a renewed effort using modern DNA technology. The remains of the 8 still unidentified victims were exhumed. DNA was extracted. The sheriff's office asked anyone who had a male relative disappear in the Chicago area between 1970 and 1978 to contact them for DNA comparison. This effort led to one identification: William Bundy, 19 years old when he disappeared in 1976. He was identified in 2011 through DNA comparison with his sister. As of 2026, 7 victims remain unidentified. They are known only as Victim 5, Victim 10, Victim 13, Victim 19, Victim 21, Victim 26, and Victim 28. 7 young men whose families never knew what happened to them. 7 people who deserve to have their names restored. The identified victims deserve to be remembered as people, not just as statistics in John Wayne Gacy's victim count. Timothy McCoy, 16. He was traveling from Michigan to Nebraska to see his father. He loved music. He was polite and trusting. Gacy murdered him and threw his body in a river. John Butkovich, 17. He worked hard for PDM contractors. When Gacy refused to pay him, he stood up for himself. Gacy murdered him for that. Darrell Sampson, 18. He loved to dance. He had dreams of becoming a professional dancer. Gacy murdered him and buried him under the dining room. Gregory Godzik, 17. Another PDM employee. His family never stopped searching for him. They suspected Gacy from the beginning but couldn't prove anything until the house was excavated. John Scheich, 19. He was identified by his high school class ring. That ring represented achievement, graduation, a future. Gacy stole all of that. Matthew Bowman, 19. He disappeared after a 4th of July party. His family searched for him for years. Robert Piest, 15. It was his birthday when he disappeared. He just wanted information about a summer job. His mother's determination to find him led to Gacy's capture and saved countless future victims. And 26 others. Each one a person with family who loved them, with friends who missed them, with dreams and futures that were stolen. John Wayne Gacy's house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was demolished in April 1979, 4 months after the bodies were discovered. The lot sat empty for years because nobody wanted to live where 29 bodies had been buried. Eventually, in 1986, a new house was built on the lot. The address was changed to 8215 West Somerdale to distance the property from its horrific history. As of 2026, the house is occupied by a family unconnected to the case. The location remains a dark landmark in Chicago's history. True crime enthusiasts occasionally visit the site. Neighbors have reported feeling uncomfortable knowing what happened there decades ago. But the real legacy of the Gacy case isn't a house or a location. It's the systemic changes that followed. After Gacy's arrest, law enforcement agencies improved their missing persons procedures. Police departments began taking runaway reports more seriously. Communication between jurisdictions improved. Databases were created to track missing persons and serial murder patterns across the country. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized youth. Advocacy organizations formed to protect runaways and LGBT youth from exploitation. Social services improved. The attitudes that had allowed Gacy to prey on throwaway kids began to change. John Wayne Gacy has become a symbol of evil hiding behind a facade of normalcy. The friendly neighbor who's actually a monster. The clown who brings joy to children but murders them in secret. This archetype has appeared in countless books, movies, and television shows. Stephen King famously used Gacy as partial inspiration for Pennywise the Clown in his novel It. The idea of a clown as a figure of terror rather than fun draws directly from Gacy's crimes. Netflix released Conversations with a Killer, the John Wayne Gacy tapes, in 2022, featuring previously unheard audio recordings of Gacy discussing his crimes. Peacock released John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise with additional archival footage. These documentaries serve an important purpose. They keep the story alive, remind new generations about the victims, and analyze what went wrong to prevent similar tragedies in the future. But they also raise ethical questions. Are we exploiting the victims' memories for entertainment? Are we giving Gacy the attention and notoriety he craved? How do we balance public interest in understanding evil with respect for the dead? There are no easy answers, but what's clear is that any discussion of John Wayne Gacy must center the victims, must remember them as people who mattered, whose lives had value, whose deaths were tragic losses. John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer who murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. He hid behind a mask of respectability, a successful businessman, a community volunteer, a man who entertained sick children as Pogo the Clown. But beneath that mask was a predator, a man who lured vulnerable young men to his house with promises of work or money, a man who tortured and murdered them, a man who buried 29 bodies in the crawl space under his house and threw 4 more into a river. He was finally caught because one mother, Elizabeth Piest, refused to accept that her son had simply run away. Because one police officer, Lieutenant Joseph Kozingczak, took that mother seriously and investigated immediately. Because investigators followed the evidence wherever it led, even when it led to a respectable community member. Gacy was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed in 1994. But the pain he caused continues. Families still grieve. 7 victims remain unidentified, their families never knowing what happened to their sons and brothers. This is the complete story of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown.